You're listening to Trail Mixed, an ecological show about art produced by the artist, pedestrian and writer Bram Thomas Arnold.
Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions. Now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Morning. So it's exactly 7 a.m. On Friday, 26th, and the air is wet. Sky is grey. The fog has lifted and become suspiciously cloudlike. I'm walking out from the studio to the mine once more. Without my raincoat. And I'm here to talk through what on earth I think I'm trying to do here. To let you know as well as myself. Following Professor Caitlin De Silvy's presentation of the film Drop City at Cast Studios in Helston in February 2020, Caitlin and I discussed a book we had both seen in a second-hand shop in Falmouth. The book is an exhibition catalogue from an exhibition called Hippie Modernism that took place at the Walker Art Centre in Minneapolis in 2016. The exhibition catalogued that particular cultural moment that Drop City emerged out of. The late 60s, early 70s period of experimentalism, exploring alternative ways of being and doing, acts of civilization. This book and the ideas of Ant Farm, an arts collective exploring mobile forms of creative production, will be examined here as a critical reference point for the development of Field Station. And so, that's a bit of a vague explanation of what I'm doing here. So let's be a bit more precise than that, please. That text, then, is, if you like, the written explanation of what I proposed to make a radio show about back at the beginning of lockdown, when things were different, when Field Station was a proposal sent to a research council, when COVID-19 was a thing that was only just beginning to cluster around us. This is a radio show that is an experiment about the research process and practice behind getting to this point and arriving at it and realising that uncertainty is really the only reality. What you're currently listening to is the Dawn Chorus at End of the World Garden, which was due to be live broadcast as part of Sound Camp on Resonance FM on the 3rd of May this year. But due to the fact that lockdown had happened, and the fact that at 5:45 in the morning exactly someone in a field nearby to where we were attempting to live stream the Dawn Chorus from turned on a Wi-Fi device. Our signal entirely cut out, and we couldn't broadcast. So this is a little extract of a dawn chorus that happened during lockdown that no one else heard, because no one else was able to come, and because the stream didn't go live. And so what I'm trying to do here is make a radio show that is a non-linear, associative sketchbook of research, ideas and contexts for a proposal that I wrote for a Landscape Decisions Fellowship with Exeter University through the Natural Environment Research Council. In the current great conservation debate, it seems there is increasingly less common ground to stand on. Should we be mourning the end of the wild, following Stephen Mayer, or should we celebrate the new wild, as Fred Peace urges? Are we living through an age of biological annihilation, or is nature thriving in an age of extinction? Should we follow the call to now fully and responsibly accept human stewardship of Anthropocene Earth, or is this typical of human hubris, and should we be sceptical of any attempt to place humanity at the steering wheel of spaceship Earth? Should we be radically mixing societies and biodiversity into new and potentially exciting socio-natural arrangements, or should we radically separate people and much of the rest of biodiversity in order to enable more sustainable futures? Or are all these considerations unrealistic, and ought we instead simply to focus on improving mainstream conservation business as usual? These important questions and others are raised by the current debate. We add one more. Are there ways to diffuse their all or nothing, black and white connotations, and find other ways to frame the Anthropocene conservation debate altogether? That was an extract from The Conservation Revolution by Bram Busher and Robert Fletcher, published by Verso in 2020. Can we become comfortable in the uncertainty of not being definitive, not being categoric, not being black or white? Can we find a space in the greyness between A and B, between the beginning of the transect and the end? Can we acknowledge that there is a beginning, but there's always something further back? And can we find a way of becoming comfortable with that? That was a track by Claire M. Singer called Riona Gatuath. The music you've just been listening to was released by Touch during lockdown as part of their new subscription program called Isolation. You can check it out more at touch33.net. We'll be playing more from Touch later in the show. And a transect for Trelowarren, which is the name of the project from whence this radio show emerged, was an attempt to question the word for in the title, the word for in all our doings and beings as a team of ecologists, geographers, geologists and botanists examined an estate on the Lizard Peninsula called Trelowarren. For a transect, a given line across a field used as a way of denoting biodiversity therein is definitely always for something. But modern interpretations of science have enabled us to convince ourselves of a form of objectivity that I'm not sure really exists. We too often roam a landscape and talk about what it is best for, or what we think is best for it, and what might be best for it. What was it? What is it? And the orchid just blooms regardless. The cuckoos just rob nests regardless. The nightjars squeal like goats in the night regardless. The mycelium spreads beneath us regardless. Time becomes deeper regardless. The brown trout in the river recover from environmental pollution regardless. The beech trees brought over in the 1500s keep growing regardless. Landscape becomes wild best when regarded less. This radio show, and all my other work in many ways, is attempting to establish the notion of an ecological form of subjectivity, wherein our subjectivity is not attached solely to us, but is embedded amidst the ecological global processes we live amongst. Red Campion, an army of fox on a recently excoriated field of mercury, robins and house red campion, an army of fox, the edge of an early morning, where sunrise happened behind bogs stood layers of water, grey silent fragment of a grey silent world. Objective 1. Plan and run a residential workshop at Kessel Barton Gallery on the Lizard with invited artists and the core team of scientists at the ESI, in order to collaboratively distill key methods that can be implemented from a field laboratory setting and integrated into the design of the mobile field station. Dr. Arnold has previously run a number of residencies at rural art centres nationally, and this element of the project will build on this prior experience and focus it upon the problem of generating transdisciplinary methods and instigating conversation and collaboration across disciplines that function from their own unique baselines of understanding and frames of reference. Caitlin De Silva is a geographer, a human geographer based at University of Exeter's Environment and Sustainability Institute. I've been working with her on a project called the Transecting the Lizard as part of a creative fellowship with Arts and Culture at Exeter. At Trello Warren on the Lizard, who are a 700-year-old country estate who are looking to transition their lands into a form of rewilding, a form of regenerative agriculture, a form of wilded landscape, managed wilding. In conversation last year, Sir Ferrers Vivian of Trello Warren Estate stated knowingly, "One cannot care about the landscape unless one owns it." Rather than narrowly interpret this as an assertion of title, one can infer that to own in this context means to understand, to know, to care for. A form of ownership that exists beyond notions of quantification, monetization, or exchange. Transecting the Lizard field station aims to generate transferable and transdisciplinary methods of citizen science and creative community arts practice that enable small landowners and members of the wider local community to generate a sense of ownership in the decision-making processes going on around them, not through possession of acreage or title, but through understanding and humility in relation to the needs of their cohabitants, the flora and fauna of the more than human ecology on the Lizard, one of Britain's most unique, outstanding and oft misunderstood geological and natural habitats. It does this through the development of a field station which functions as a mobile transdisciplinary laboratory for both the generation and accumulation of methods and data from a variety of scientific and arts and humanities methods developed and applied at iterative stages through this 2-year project.
Okay, but Bram, you invited me here to talk about...
Yes.
There was a moment. Okay, let's go back. February
Yeah, so there was a point.
28th was when we met here
Yes.
for the screening.
Yeah, so it was for the screening of a film called Drop City. I feel like either before or after that screening, we'd had a conversation about the fact that we'd both looked at this book called Hippie Modernism in a shop in Falmouth. And after the screening, so I went and bought it, and it was the only copy they had. So I've got it here. And in that book, there's an art project by an arts collective called Ant Farm, who I'd previously vaguely heard of, but not really. And Ant Farm made a project called Media Van, which was a mobile vehicle they physically made that had in the back of it all the necessary equipment to tour around America and occasionally stop off at various educational spots or arts groups or collective happenings and make art films and show them in an inflatable projection suite that they built off the back of the van.
In the 70s?
In the 70s, yeah.
Right, yeah, okay, so, but the Drop City art, by comparison, was that giant mandala that they would travel around with and spin so that people could stare at it.
Yeah,
and
so it was one of the, it was a thing
trippy
people could stare at. It was like Glastonbury Festival before Glastonbury Festival.
Right, okay.
And so that was obviously an influence. And then additionally, I think Buckminster Fuller became an influence. You know, he was famous for asking the question, how much does your building weigh?
This is the voice of Chip Lord, who was one of the co-founders of Ant Farm.
A very simple kind of riddle that nobody could ever answer. And yet, with the implication of your building should be more efficient, it should be designed in a more efficient way, perhaps. And when the Whole Earth Catalog was first published by Stuart Brand, I think it might have been 1967, Buckminster Fuller was one of the kind of mentors of Stuart Brand, and there was always a section in the front of the Whole Earth Catalog about Fuller's work and his writing. And I consider the Whole Earth Catalog was, in a sense, my graduate training after a 5-year degree in architecture.
And so what I'm doing here is going for a walk to try and establish what I'm trying to talk about. Utopian architecture. The ideas of Ant Farm, Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth catalogue, 1960s counterculture, and the desire to detach from the technosphere. Spaceship Earth. Buckminster Fuller popularised the term, but it appeared originally almost a century before him in Henry George's 1879 work Progress and Poverty. In 1965, Adlai Stevenson managed to give a more poetic treatment in an address before the United Nations Social and Economic Council in Geneva. We travel together, passengers on a little spaceship, dependent on its vulnerable reserves of air and soil, all committed for our safety to its security and peace, preserved from annihilation only by the care, the work, and, I will say, the love we give our fragile craft. We cannot maintain it half fortunate, half miserable, half confident, half despairing, half slave to the ancient enemies of man, half free in a liberation of resources undreamed of until this day. No craft, no crew can safely travel with such vast contradictions. On their resolution depends the survival of us all. That was an extract from David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth, footnote number 227. This is a track by Finesse called Per Aspera, Ad Astra, released on Touch Isolation during lockdown.
So I have two things that I can choose which one you want me to read.
Cool.
All right. Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
So, and they're not unrelated to the work that we hope to do together at Trelleborn, I think, because my imagination tends to be a little bit more organic, thinking perhaps with plants rather than material.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we have here, oh, sorry, that's the flapping of ancient newsprint. Quite yellow now.
Yeah.
Both 1997.
Okay.
Okay, 1997, Missoula, Montana. But what's key about this is perhaps that you can make an argument that it's about a quarter century from sort of a peak, or maybe a little bit post-peak, early 70s, I would say, with a lot of this stuff really kicking off. And so that was my parents' generation. And so then I spent the 90s living in Missoula, working at the Missoula Urban Demonstration Project and being a sustainable farmer and I had a regular column for about a year-ish, maybe two, in the Northern Rockies Comic Gazette, which was mostly comics.
Yeah.
and then
it says on the tin.
And then Bill Chalupka and I each had a column. So the 90s in the US were like this really schizoid time where you had, on the other one hand, you had Martha Stewart, you know, the sort of lifestyle stuff, right? So you have Martha Stewart living, because in 97 was when people were just starting to realize the potential for what the internet could sort of be.
Okay.
It had moved from being just this sort of slightly clunky tool to start, you know, everybody was making their own website. Anyway, so Martha Stewart living was like a huge brand in the US, and so the guy who invited me to do my column decided to call it Caitlin DeSilvy's Sustainable Living. And that was supposed to be this big joke, which I'm sure that that nobody ever got, right?
I'm sure some people did.
So this particular column of Caitlin DeSilvy's Sustainable Living actually does engage with, well, it sits in this weird pivot point where Martha Stewart's actual presence in this sort of style setting for the 1990s converged with where I happen to live.
Okay.
Which I will explain if you let me read it, if you'd like me to read it. But it also anticipates something about where we've arrived in a strange way.
Okay.
And there is this sort of element of like performing a certain kind of sustainable living, call it what you will, you know, sort of, we weren't rural. And so goes the column. When Steve named this column Caitlin DeSilvy's Sustainable Living in mock homage to Martha Stewart's bizarre kingdom of style, I wasn't convinced that the average reader, me included, would pull the intended irony out of the title. Pompous or pithy, but last week the mailman dropped off a big white envelope in the mud mailbox, and the contents made me wonder if I have more in common with Martha than I'd like to admit. The first thing I pulled out of the envelope was a glossy newsletter labeled Iconoculture, Signs of the Times, with Martha scrolled in blue background letters down the cover. Tasteful leaves, pliers, and paintbrushes complemented the design scheme. I flipped it over and found the self-stated mission for the magazine. Iconoculture prospects the juiciest parts of the cultural landscape as an actionable resource for business. Actionable resource? Looking for an explanation, I opened to the center spread and found the word iconogasm emblazoned across the top. Above a subheading that defined iconogasms as cultural climaxes, marketing opportunities. This issue, it seems, was devoted to Martha Mania, the iconogasm of the moment. The spread began by asking, "Is Martha Stewart living?" and went on to highlight random cultural trends, such as home sewing, indicative of our obsession with all things home and garden. This is their quote. Confused, I reached into the envelope again and found a letter addressed to the Missoula Urban Demonstrations Project. The letter thanked MUD for responding with the information they had requested. I later found that a co-worker had answered a few phone questions. And a handwritten note at the bottom advised us to see page 3 for MUD Project. And there we were. The chatty caption at the top of the page read, "We headed out west this spring to track the trends in the still snowy high country of Montana." Then, in one remarkably brief and selective paragraph, iconoculture captured Missoula, Montana. The headline, no capital letters, was, "The Big Sky States the Limit, Crossing Cultural Fences." They gave our location, snugged up against the Clark Fork of the Columbia, our population, 43,000, and our common occupations, writer, potter, painter, sculptor, photographer, rancher, and quipped, "It's a crunchy bowl of granola with an outdoor eco-ethos second to none." The next pertinent detail about Missoula was this sentence: "The Missoula Urban Demonstration Project is always more than cordial, eager to tour you through their straw bale greenhouse." Really? The paragraph ran on to quote a few Wild West headlines and give a coy description of events in the gay Missoula pageant. The jumble ended with the quote, "Mixing cultures and metaphors, whether in food or lifestyle preferences, has come to Marlborough County." The whole thing read as if someone in Minneapolis had come across one issue of the Missoulian newspaper and fabricated a fantasy land out of spare parts. Still baffled, I dug deeper into the packet and pulled out another glossy flyer and a subscription form to Iconoculture. Apparently MUD and Missoula had ended up in a cultural trend newsletter, which is solely dedicated and uniquely equipped to translating the signs of the times into high-priority ideas for your marketplace. The plot thickened and then set like a jello mold when I found the list of subscribers and clients. The agencies and consultants category bulged with advertising giants like Saatchi & Saatchi. Even more frightening, in the marketers and media category, I found, among others, American Express, Coca-Cola, Coors, General Mills, Hallmark Cards, Mall of America, Mattel Toys, Target stores, Wall Street Journal. You get the idea. We'd been found, packaged, spun, and tossed into the hungry jaws of corporate America. At least the folks at Iconoculture were kind enough to warn us that Missoula represents one of their new target trends, ripe for exploitation and market manipulation. What happens next? Do we feed one of their corporate projects as a product concept for the back of a cereal box? Or maybe we'll end up in a marketing scheme for Givaudan Roux, developer deluxe of fragrances. New scents might include Stone Container Symphony, our local cardboard plant, or Malfunction Monoxide Medley, a particularly notable junction. According to Iconoculture's literature, Wendy's is on the lookout for a clue to attracting that goateed, green-dayed, gorilla-esque Generation Xer. Perhaps we can be of assistance. A straw bale Wendy's franchise. Dandelion greens in the salad bar. The May-June issue of Iconoculture featured a Century of the Home chart tracing the evolution of domestic trends through the 20th century. Categories included the paradigm, the house, the appliance, the innovation, the marketer, the rage. The rage of the 1990s was predictably listed as Marthamania. The 1960s rage was waterbed. This also seemed fairly comprehensible until I looked up the projected rage for the 2000s. Virtual canning. What? From all the propaganda in front of me, I'd gathered that the most MUD could possibly hope for would be to reach the status of Martha and be labeled as that cultural climax and pinnacle of marketing potential, the iconogasm. From the look of things, we may be on our way. I can only assume that virtual canning represents some amalgam of sturdy self-reliance and cyberspace. If iconoculture is on the money, we are graduating from the slick sweetness of Martha Stewart to a symbolic, wired jar of jam. If mud stays as cordial and eager as it already is, it may be poised to ride the wave into the great marketplace. How about online canning and food preservation workshops, internet compost piles, information superhighway bike lanes? Whatever the implications, we are feeling reassured that our work will continue to remain a juicy part of the cultural landscape, even if the cans become virtual and the metaphors marketable.
So, if this is to be a working towards a sketchbook of a non-linear, narrative, cyclic thing that is about transecting the lizard, a project called Field Station, then where does it begin? How does it end? The plan was, in many ways, to make these radio shows before I knew the outcome of that application. But such are timelines under lockdown that sadly I know the outcome of that application, and I haven't made these radio shows yet. For the vast majority of our species' time on this planet, time has been a non-linear entity. Time and the clock and the train and the station and the interconnectedness of Western civilization is a modern entity. Prior to all this, time was cyclical, a process of rise and fall, birth and death, circular, seasonal. The perception of time as linear, progress as linear, towards a given horizon, towards a given event, is new, but a particular way of seeing the world. And that particular way of seeing the world has enabled us to cut ourselves off from the natural world, to stand over the natural world, rather than to accept that we are part of it, to lord ourselves over it. Objective 2. Utilise and refine selected methods through practice in the field by using the field station to undertake transdisciplinary baseline surveys on the lizard with local artists, members of the community including landowners, and the core team from the ESI. Transecting the Lizard Field Station builds on work previously undertaken with the core team at the ESI and the Trelawarren Estate, and part of this fellowship's function is to extend and develop the baseline surveys undertaken, to build a baseline understanding of how ongoing changes in the forms of land management on the lizard affect the biodiversity therein. It is for this reason the fellowship is proposing to build a field station that becomes part of the community, enabling the work to continue for years to come. And so why am I talking about Ant Farm? Why do I want to talk to you about Ant Farm? I partly want to talk to you about Ant Farm because you probably haven't heard of them. I've barely heard of them. There's an interest, there's a desire, and this is taking me back to that first attempt at describing what I'm doing by having faith in myself. There is an intuitive process going on here. I am interested in my own uncertainty in the pursuit of it. The boundary of art practice is always the boundary of your own certainty or uncertainty. The desire to get to that edge and over it is what makes us return to making art all the time. It is the edge of the possible. It is the probable, the intuitive, the process, the uncertainty. And it is sparked out of my desire or my realization that what I am often doing when I'm trying to make art or talk about making art or make art by talking about making art is an attempt to become comfortable with my own uncertainty.
Okay, so that brings me to the Media Van project. And this is the first iteration of the Media Van. A Chevy van that's been outfitted both, I think, in a way to look technological by the roofscape has the aluminum bowls actually have stereo speakers in them. Then there's the large plexiglass dome, which is a sort of a crow's nest for shooting video while on the road. And we did travel to Cal Arts to do a workshop that involved doing some of the modifications and installing some of these bubble windows. But at the same time, we had the opportunity through a small grant to project an idea of that was called the Truck Stop Network. And I want to just quote from how Felicity Scott describes it in her book, Living Archive 7. It was a proposal for an interconnected system of life support nodes, housing services, which included both electricity, gas, water, sewage, such as any RV park would, but also access to cable TV, computers, and workshops to have total do-it-yourself capability to work on either your truck or to continue building the house that might be on the back of your truck. And she goes on to say, then operating in association with mobile equipment, which included nomadic truckitecture, such as converted buses and vans. And there was one of those out in the street yesterday, I think. And these were, of course, symbols of the counterculture. And the idea of the Truck Stop Network was to make a community, to be the architects of a community that would serve a continuously mobile population of citizens traveling most of the time, but stopping at these truck stops, which would offer then services like a village or a town. So the project was done in two phases of proposals that were purely a utopian idea, and the grant supported the sort of design and development of this idea, and it was eventually to be shown at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington. They were the fiscal sponsor, but in the end that exhibition didn't happen.
And so where do you start? Where do you end? I am fascinated by the idea that there really is no beginning nor no end. There is just a circular, spiralic process. It spirals out and it spirals in. And we are just a part of the loop. We are just a part of something. We are not apart from it. We are a part of it. Those of us who live in the postmodern world are all progressives now. Even those of us who believe we are rebelling against this notion find ourselves caught up in it. We have been brought up to believe that history marches in one direction, and that this requires us to be either optimistic or pessimistic about the direction of the march. We can choose to believe that everything is getting better, or that everything is getting worse, but both beliefs take us endlessly forward. Whether the past was misery and the future is utopia, or the past was the utopia and the future offers only apocalypse, the progressive vision requires us to believe that the line, not the circle, is the framing image of our journey through life. It's an extract from Paul Kingsnorth's essay, published in Emergence magazine. In his essay Dark Ecology, Paul Kingsnorth refers to A Short History of Progress by Ronald Wright. It's a book about the idea that maybe progress has always only been a myth, or a byproduct of need, and that actually we've always only ever done things because we had to, never because we wanted to. As far back as the agrarian revolution at the end of the Ice Age, when we moved from hunter-gatherers to farmers, that step where actually we didn't do it because we thought farming would be more comfortable. We did it because we ran out of animals to eat, and we had to stop. And that did add to a sense of progression, the step towards habited civilization, but also was done out of need rather than desire. So is desire a perpetual myth that we keep chasing? We're actually all just forever only doing the only thing we ever can.
Too much self-awareness and crippling self-consciousness about this stuff isn't helpful either, though, is it? So
no, and
this is the question. So where do we find a way to make your mobile vehicle not worry about the fact that other people have made mobile vehicles?
Yeah, I mean,
take it to Trelleborn and do some important work.
Yeah.
Trying to count how many grass species Ferrers has in his fields, because that's
I definitely don't think I wasn't worried about the fact that someone had done it before. It was partly validation, and partly also adding to a lineage. And Tracy Wall once told me that art is a sort of process of a conversation throughout history with itself, and so it's actually really reassuring to find something in the art world that you can latch onto, and so that's kind of what that was.
Yeah. So actually, in a way,
it was a bit of validation.
It's the same as, finding a poem that resonates, or feeling some kind of affinity and connection with the people who've attempted to live self-reliantly throughout the ages and usually given it up by the time they turn 40. But still, it's something we need to do.
Yes, it is. So the legacies of Western mechanism have manifested through repeated assertions of human exceptionalism. that man is the only animal to make tools, that man is the only animal with language, a sense of fairness, generosity, laughter, that man is the only mindful creature. On one hand, all of these claims to exceptionalism have been thoroughly undermined. Other beings also do wonderful and clever things. We are not a unique outlier, but rather are part of various continua. On the other hand, however, the term Anthropocene reminds us that it is not yet time to jettison a sense of human exceptionalism. Instead, by foregrounding the exceptional damage that humans are causing, the Anthropocene shows us the need for radically reworked forms of attention to what marks the human species as different. That's an extract from Deborah Bird Rose in The Art of Living on a Damaged Planet, when all your love is being trashed. This is Rosie Parlane, also again released by Touch Isolation. During lockdown, the track's called Awa. It's exhausting, sort of, capitalism's ability to fold anything into it.
It is remarkable, and it's complete now, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that absurdist vision at the end
Yeah.
is the life we live now.
Yeah, quite close to quite a lot of reality. Yeah.
Everything, yeah. But I think actually that does capture something about, like, I think it's that weird mashup of the sort of handmade and the authentic, which then immediately attracts, the iconoculture marketing trends magazine, and then consumes it. And I think the thing that sits at the back of my mind in all this is like, well, where does the art world sit in that space, right?
And so subsequently this radio show is really about layering those interests, creating or constructing the critical context for Field Station to sit in, through the practice-based process of making some radio shows about thinking about making a thing. And that's sort of where we are. So we'll probably try one more time to clearly explain what this thing is about. But what I hope is becoming apparent is that this thing isn't clearly about any one thing. It is about the muddy water between disciplines. It is about the muddy water between ideas, processes, methods, and people, individuals, projects, contexts, our lives and the life of the planet we live on. It is about becoming comfortable in the uncertainty and the mess of all that. That's what I'm really interested in. Is actually having public conversations about how uncertain we are about anything. Because it's my belief, my faith, that uncertainty breeds humility and wonder. And I have no idea what that bird was, but I hope this microphone is picking this up. I think someone would probably tell me that that was just a song thrush. And saying that's just a song thrush is such a derogatory way of saying it was just a song thrush. For if that wasn't a moment of beauty and light and wonder in your day, as well as it was in mine, then I think a little bit of realignment of perspective is probably in order for civilization to stable itself. Trail Mixed is produced by the artist, pedestrian and writer Bram Thomas Arnold. For more information, see www.bramthomasarnold.com.